I left Logan to make the proper disposition of his troops for the night, while I rode into the town with an escort of about 20 cavalry. Admiral Porter had already arrived with his fleet. The enemy had abandoned his heavy guns and evacuated the place. When I reached Grand Gulf on May 3rd, I had not been with my baggage since the 27th of April, and consequently had had no change of underclothing, no meal except such as I could pick up sometimes at other headquarters, and no tent to cover me. The first thing I did was to get a bath, borrow some fresh underclothing from one of the naval officers, and get a good meal on the flagship. Then I wrote letters to the General-in-Chief informing him of our present position, dispatches to be telegraphed from Cairo, orders to General Sullivan commanding above Vicksburg, and gave orders to all my corps commanders. About 12 o'clock at night, I was through my work and started for Hankinson's Ferry, arriving there before daylight. While at Grand Gulf, I heard from Banks, who was on the Red River, and who said that he could not be at Port Hudson before the 10th of May, and then with only 15,000 men. Up to this time, my intention had been to secure Grand Gulf as a base of supplies, detach McClernand's corps to Banks, and cooperate with him in the reduction of Port Hudson. The news from Banks forced upon me a different plan of campaign from the one intended. To wait for his cooperation would have detained me at least a month. The reinforcements would not have reached 10,000 men after deducting casualties and necessary river guards at all high points close to the river for over 300 miles. The enemy would have strengthened his position and been reinforced by more men than Banks could have brought. I therefore determined to move independently of Banks, cut loose from my base, destroy the rebel force in the rear of Vicksburg, and invest or capture the city. Grand Gulf was accordingly given up as a base, and the authorities at Washington were notified. I knew well that Halleck's caution would lead him to disapprove of this course, but it was the only one that gave any chance of success. The time it would take to communicate with Washington and get a reply would be so great that I could not be interfered with until it was demonstrated whether my plan was practicable. Even Sherman, who afterward ignored bases of supplies other than what were afforded by the country while marching through 4 states of the Confederacy with an army more than twice as large as mine at this time, wrote to me from Hankinson's Ferry, advising me of the impossibility of supplying our army over a single road. He urged me to stop all troops till your army is partially supplied with wagons, and then act as quick as possible, for this road will be jammed as sure as life. To this I replied, I do not calculate upon the possibility of supplying the army with full rations from Grand Gulf. I know it will be impossible without constructing additional roads. What I do expect is to get up what rations of hard bread, coffee, and salt we can, and make the country furnish the balance. We started from Bruinsburg with an average of about 2 days' rations, and received no more from our own supplies for some days. Abundance was found in the meantime. A delay would give the enemy time to reinforce and fortify. McClernand's and McPherson's commands were kept substantially as they were on the night of the 2nd, awaiting supplies sufficient to give them 3 days' rations in haversacks. Beef, mutton, poultry, and forage were found in abundance. Quite a quantity of bacon and molasses was also secured from the country, but bread and coffee could not be obtained in quantities sufficient for all the men. Every plantation, however, had a run of stone, propelled by mule power, to grind corn for the owners and their slaves. All these were kept running while we were stopping, day and night, and when we were marching during the night at all plantations covered by the troops. But the product was taken by the troops nearest, so that the majority of the command was destined to go without bread until a new base was established on the Yazoo above Vicksburg. While the troops were awaiting the arrival of rations, I ordered reconnaissances made by McClernand and McPherson, with the view of leading the enemy to believe that we intended to cross the Big Black and attack the city at once. On the 6th, Sherman arrived at Grand Gulf and crossed his command that night and the next day. 3 days' rations had been brought up from Grand Gulf for the advanced troops and were issued. Orders were given for a forward movement the next day. Sherman was directed to order up Blair, who had been left behind to guard the road from Milliken's Bend to Hard Times with 2 brigades. The quartermaster at Young's Point was ordered to send 200 wagons with Blair, and the commissary was to load them with hard bread, coffee, sugar, salt, and 100,000 pounds of salt meat. On the 3rd, Hurlbut, who had been left at Memphis, was ordered to send 4 regiments from his command to Milliken's Bend to relieve Blair's division, and on the 5th he was ordered to send Lauman's division in addition, the latter to join the army in the field. The 4 regiments were to be taken from troops near the river so that there would be no delay. During the night of the 6th, McPherson drew in his troops north of the Big Black and was off at an early hour on the road to Jackson, via Rocky Springs, Utica, and Raymond. That night he and McClernand were both at Rocky Springs 10 miles from Hankinson's Ferry. McPherson remained there during the 8th, while McClernand moved to Big Sandy, and Sherman marched from Grand Gulf to Hankinson's Ferry. On the 9th, McPherson moved to a point within a few miles west of Utica. McClernand and Sherman remained where they were. On the 10th, McPherson moved to Utica, Sherman to Big Sandy. McClernand was still at Big Sandy. On the 11th, McClernand was at 5 Mile Creek, Sherman at Auburn, McPherson 5 miles advanced from Utica. May 12th, McClernand was at 14 Mile Creek, Sherman at 14 Mile Creek, McPherson at Raymond after a battle. After McPherson crossed the Big Black at Hankinson's Ferry, Vicksburg could have been approached and besieged by the south side. It is not probable, however, that Pemberton would have permitted a close besiegement. The broken nature of the ground would have enabled him to hold a strong defensible line from the river south of the city to the Big Black, retaining possession of the railroad back to that point. It was my plan, therefore, to get to the railroad east of Vicksburg and approach from that direction. Accordingly, McPherson's troops that had crossed the Big Black were withdrawn, and the movement east to Jackson commenced. As has been stated before, the country is very much broken, and the roads generally confined to the tops of the hills. The troops were moved 1, sometimes 2 corps at a time to reach designated points out parallel to the railroad, and only from 6 to 10 miles from it. McClernand's corps was kept with its left flank on the Big Black, guarding all the crossings. 14 Mile Creek, a stream substantially parallel with the railroad, was reached and crossings effected by McClernand and Sherman with slight loss. McPherson was to the right of Sherman, extending to Raymond. The cavalry was used in this advance in reconnoitring to find the roads, to cover our advances and to find the most practicable routes from one command to another so they could support each other in case of an attack. In making this move, I estimated Pemberton's movable force at Vicksburg at about 18,000 men, with smaller forces at Haynes's Bluff and Jackson. It would not be possible for Pemberton to attack me with all his troops at one place, and I determined to throw my army between his and fight him in detail. This was done with success, but I found afterwards that I had entirely underestimated Pemberton's strength. Up to this point, our movements had been made without serious opposition. My line was now nearly parallel with the Jackson and Vicksburg Railroad, and about 7 miles south of it. The right was at Raymond, 18 miles from Jackson, McPherson commanding. Sherman in the centre on 14 Mile Creek, his advance thrown across. McClernand to the left, also on 14 Mile Creek, advance across, and his pickets within 2 miles of Edwards Station, where the enemy had concentrated a considerable force, and where they undoubtedly expected us to attack. McClernand's left was on the Big Black. In all our moves up to this time, the left had hugged the Big Black closely, and all the ferries had been guarded to prevent the enemy from throwing a force on our rear. McPherson encountered the enemy, 5,000 strong with 2 batteries under General Gregg, about 2 miles out of Raymond. This was about 2 p.m. Logan was in advance with one of his brigades. He deployed and moved up to engage the enemy. McPherson ordered the road in rear to be cleared of wagons, and the balance of Logan's division and Crocker's, which was still farther in rear, to come forward with all dispatch. The order was obeyed with alacrity. Logan got his division in position for assault before Crocker could get up, and attacked with vigour, carrying the enemy's position easily, sending Gregg flying from the field not to appear against our front again until we met at Jackson. In this battle, McPherson lost 66 killed, 339 wounded, and 37 missing, nearly or quite all from Logan's division. The enemy's loss was 100 killed, 305 wounded, besides 415 taken prisoners. I regarded Logan and Crocker as being as competent division commanders as could be found in or out of the army, and both equal to a much higher command. Crocker, however, was dying of consumption when he volunteered. His weak condition never put him on the sick report when there was a battle in prospect, as long as he could keep on his feet. He died not long after the close of the rebellion. When the news reached me of McPherson's victory at Raymond about sundown, my position was with Sherman. I decided at once to turn the whole column towards Jackson and capture that place without delay. Pemberton was now on my left, with, as I supposed, about 18,000 men. In fact, as I learned afterward, with nearly 50,000. A force was also collecting on my right at Jackson, the point where all the railroads communicating with Vicksburg connect. All the enemy's supplies of men and stores would come by that point. As I hoped in the end to besiege Vicksburg, I must first destroy all possibility of aid. I therefore determined to move swiftly towards Jackson, destroy or drive any force in that direction, and then turn upon Pemberton. But by moving against Jackson, I uncovered my own communication. So I finally decided to have none, to cut loose altogether from my base and move my whole force eastward. I then had no fears for my communications, and if I moved quickly enough could turn upon Pemberton before he could attack me in the rear. Accordingly, all previous orders given during the day for movements on the 13th were annulled by new ones. McPherson was ordered at daylight to move on Clinton, 10 miles from Jackson. Sherman was notified of my determination to capture Jackson and work from there westward. He was ordered to start at 4 in the morning and march to Raymond. McClernand was ordered to march with 3 divisions by Dillon's to Raymond. 1 was left to guard the crossing of the Big Black. On the 10th, I had received a letter from Banks on the Red River, asking reinforcements. Porter had gone to his assistance with a part of his fleet on the 3D, and I now wrote to him describing my position and declining to send any troops. I looked upon side movements as long as the enemy held Port Hudson and Vicksburg as a waste of time and material. General Joseph E. Johnston arrived at Jackson in the night of the 13th from Tennessee and immediately assumed command of all the Confederate troops in Mississippi. I knew he was expecting reinforcements from the south and east. On the 6th, I had written to General Halleck, "Information from the other side leaves me to believe the enemy are bringing forces from Tullahoma." Up to this time, my troops had been kept in supporting distances of each other, as far as the nature of the country would admit. Reconnaissances were constantly made from each corps to enable them to acquaint themselves with the most practicable routes from one to another, in case a union became necessary. McPherson reached Clinton with the advance early on the 13th, and immediately set to work destroying the railroad. Sherman's advance reached Raymond before the last of McPherson's command had got out of the town. McClernand withdrew from the front of the enemy at Edwards Station with much skill and without loss, and reached his position for the night in good order. On the night of the 13th, McPherson was ordered to march at early dawn upon Jackson, only 15 miles away. Sherman was given the same order, but he was to move by the direct road from Raymond to Jackson, which is south of the road McPherson was on, and does not approach within 2 miles of it at the point where it crossed the line of entrenchments which at that time defended the city. McClernand was ordered to move 1 division of his command to Clinton, 1 division a few miles beyond Mississippi Springs following Sherman's line, and a 3rd to Raymond. He was also directed to send his siege guns, 4 in number, with the troops going by Mississippi Springs. McClernand's position was an advantageous one in any event. With 1 division at Clinton, he was in position to reinforce McPherson at Jackson rapidly if it became necessary. The division beyond Mississippi Springs was equally available to reinforce Sherman. The one at Raymond could take either road. He still had 2 other divisions farther back now that Blair had come up, available within a day at Jackson. If this last command should not be wanted at Jackson, they were already 1 day's march from there on their way to Vicksburg, and on 3 different roads leading to the latter city. But the most important consideration in my mind was to have a force confronting Pemberton if he should come out to attack my rear. This I expected him to do. As shown further on, he was directed by Johnston to make this very move. I notified General Halleck that I should attack the state capital on the 14th. A courier carried the dispatch to Grand Gulf through an unprotected country. Sherman and McPherson communicated with each other during the night and arranged to reach Jackson at about the same hour. It rained in torrents during the night of the 13th and the forepart of the day of the 14th. The roads were intolerable, and in some places on Sherman's line, where the land was low, they were covered more than a foot deep with water. But the troops never murmured. By 9 o'clock, Crocker, of McPherson's corps, who was now in advance, came upon the enemy's pickets and speedily drove them in upon the main body. They were outside of the entrenchments in a strong position, and proved to be the troops that had been driven out of Raymond. Johnston had been reinforced during the night by Georgia and South Carolina regiments, so that his force amounted to 11,000 men, and he was expecting still more. Sherman also came upon the rebel pickets some distance out from the town, but speedily drove them in. He was now on the south and southwest of Jackson, confronting the Confederates behind their breastworks, while McPherson's right was nearly 2 miles north, occupying a line running north and south across the Vicksburg Railroad. Artillery was brought up, and reconnaissances made preparatory to an assault. McPherson brought up Logan's division while he deployed Crocker's for the assault. Sherman made similar dispositions on the right. By 11 a.m. both were ready to attack. Crocker moved his division forward, preceded by a strong skirmish line. These troops at once encountered the enemy's advance and drove it back on the main body, when they returned to their proper regiment and the whole division charged, routing the enemy completely and driving him into his main line. This stand by the enemy was made more than 2 miles outside of his main fortifications. McPherson followed up with his command until within range of the guns of the enemy from their entrenchments, when he halted to bring his troops into line and reconnoitre to determine the next move. It was now about noon. While this was going on, Sherman was confronting a rebel battery which enfiladed the road on which he was marching, the Mississippi Springs Road, and commanded a bridge spanning a stream over which he had to pass. By detaching right and left, the stream was forced, and the enemy flanked and speedily driven within the main line. This brought our whole line in front of the enemy's line of works, which was continuous on the north, west, and south sides from the Pearl River north of the city to the same river south. I was with Sherman. He was confronted by a force sufficient to hold us back. Appearances did not justify an assault where we were. I had directed Sherman to send a force to the right and to reconnoitre as far as to the Pearl River. This force, Tuttle's division, not returning, I rode to the right with my staff and soon found that the enemy had left that part of the line. Tuttle's movement or McPherson's pressure had no doubt led Johnston to order a retreat, leaving only the men at the guns to retard us while he was getting away. Tuttle had seen this and, passing through the lines without resistance, came up in the rear of the artillerists confronting Sherman and captured them with 10 pieces of artillery. I rode immediately to the State House, where I was soon followed by Sherman. About the same time, McPherson discovered that the enemy was leaving his front, and advanced Crocker, who was so close upon the enemy that they could not move their guns or destroy them. He captured 7 guns and, moving on, hoisted the national flag over the rebel capital of Mississippi. Stevenson's brigade was sent to cut off the rebel retreat, but was too late or not expeditious enough. Our loss in this engagement was McPherson, 37 killed, 228 wounded, Sherman, 4 killed and 21 wounded and missing. The enemy lost 845 killed, wounded and captured. 17 guns fell into our hands, and the enemy destroyed by fire their storehouses, containing a large amount of commissary stores. On this day, Blair reached New Auburn and joined McClernand's 4th Division. He had with him 200 wagons loaded with rations, the only commissary supplies received during the entire campaign. I slept that night in the room that Johnston was said to have occupied the night before. About 4 p.m, I sent for the corps commanders and directed the dispositions to be made of their troops. Sherman was to remain in Jackson until he destroyed that place as a railroad centre and manufacturing city of military supplies. He did the work most effectually. Sherman and I went together into a manufactory which had not ceased work on account of the battle, nor for the entrance of Yankee troops. Our presence did not seem to attract the attention of either the manager or the operatives, most of whom were girls. We looked on for a while to see the tent cloth which they were making roll out of the looms, with CSA woven in each bolt. There was an immense amount of cotton in bales stacked outside. Finally, I told Sherman I thought they had done work enough. The operatives were told they could leave and take with them what cloth they could carry. In a few minutes, cotton and factory were in a blaze. The proprietor visited Washington while I was president to get his pay for this property, claiming that it was private. He asked me to give him a statement of the fact that his property had been destroyed by national troops so that he might use it with Congress where he was pressing or proposed to press his claim. I declined. On the night of the 13th, Johnston sent the following dispatch to Pemberton at Edwards Station. I have lately arrived and learn that Major General Sherman is between us with 4 divisions at Clinton. It is important to establish communication, that you may be reinforced. If practicable, come up in his rear at once. To beat such a detachment would be of immense value. All the troops you can quickly assemble should be brought. Time is all important. This dispatch was sent in triplicate by different messengers. One of the messengers happened to be a loyal man who had been expelled from Memphis some months before by Hurlbut for uttering disloyal and threatening sentiments. There was a good deal of parade about his expulsion, ostensibly as a warning to those who entertained the sentiments he expressed, but Hurlbut and the expelled man understood each other. He delivered his copy of Johnston's dispatch to McPherson, who forwarded it to me. Receiving this dispatch on the 14th, I ordered McPherson to move promptly in the morning back to Bolton, the nearest point where Johnston could reach the road. Bolton is about 20 miles west of Jackson. I also informed McClernand of the capture of Jackson and sent him the following order. It is evidently the design of the enemy to get north of us and cross the Big Black and beat us into Vicksburg. We must not allow them to do this. Turn all your forces towards Bolton Station and make all dispatch in getting there. Move troops by the most direct road from wherever they may be on the receipt of this order. And to Blair I wrote, Their design is evidently to cross the Big Black and pass down the peninsula between the Big Black and Yazoo rivers. We must beat them. Turn your troops immediately to Bolton. Take all the trains with you. Smith's division and any other troops now with you will go to the same place. If practicable, take parallel roads, so as to divide your troops and train. Johnston stopped on the Canton Road only 6 miles north of Jackson, the night of the 14th. He sent from there to Pemberton dispatches announcing the loss of Jackson and the following order. As soon as the reinforcements are all up, they must be united to the rest of the army. I am anxious to see a force assembled that may be able to inflict a heavy blow upon the enemy. Can Grant supply himself from the Mississippi? Can you not cut him off from it? And above all, should he be compelled to fall back for want of supplies, beat him. The concentration of my troops was easy, considering the character of the country. McPherson moved along the road parallel with and near the railroad. McClernand's command was 1 division, Hovey's, on the road McPherson had to take, but with a start of 4 miles. 1, Osterhaus, was at Raymond, on a converging road that intersected the other near Champion's Hill. 1, Carr's, had to pass over the same road with Osterhaus, but being back at Mississippi Springs, would not be detained by it. The 4th, Smith's, with Blair's division, was near Auburn with a different road to pass over. McClernand faced about and moved promptly. His cavalry from Raymond seized Bolton by 9:30 in the morning, driving out the enemy's pickets and capturing several men. The night of the 15th, Hovey was at Bolton. Carr and Osterhaus were about 3 miles south, but abreast, facing west. Smith was north of Raymond, with Blair in his rear. McPherson's command, with Logan in front, had marched at 7 o'clock, and by 4 reached Hovey and went into camp. Crocker bivouacked just in Hovey's rear on the Clinton Road. Sherman, with 2 divisions, was in Jackson, completing the destruction of roads, bridges, and military factories. I rode in person out to Clinton. On my arrival, I ordered McClernand to move early in the morning on Edwards Station, cautioning him to watch for the enemy and not bring on an engagement unless he felt very certain of success. I naturally expected that Pemberton would endeavour to obey the orders of his superior, which I have shown were to attack us at Clinton. This, indeed, I knew he could not do, but I felt sure he would make the attempt to reach that point. It turned out, however, that he had decided his superior's plans were impracticable, and consequently determined to move south from Edwards Station and get between me and my base. I, however, had no base, having abandoned it more than a week before. On the 15th, Pemberton had actually marched south from Edwards Station, but the rains had swollen Baker's Creek, which he had to cross so much that he could not ford it, and the bridges were washed away. This brought him back to the Jackson Road, on which there was a good bridge over Baker's Creek. Some of his troops were marching until midnight to get there. Receiving here early on the 16th a repetition of his order to join Johnston at Clinton, he concluded to obey and sent a dispatch to his chief, informing him of the route by which he might be expected. About 5 o'clock in the morning, 16th, 2 men who had been employed on the Jackson and Vicksburg Railroad were brought to me. They reported that they had passed through Pemberton's army in the night and that it was still marching east. They reported him to have 80 regiments of infantry and 10 batteries, in all about 25,000 men. I had expected to leave Sherman at Jackson another day in order to complete his work, but getting the above information I sent him orders to move with all dispatch to Bolton, and to put 1 division with an ammunition train on the road at once, with directions to its commander to march with all possible speed until he came up to our rear. Within an hour after receiving this order, Steele's division was on the road. At the same time, I dispatched to Blair, who was near Auburn, to move with all speed to Edwards Station. McClernand was directed to embrace Blair in his command for the present. Blair's division was a part of the 15th Army Corps, Sherman's, but as it was on its way to join its corps, it naturally struck our left first, now that we had faced about and were moving west. The 15th Corps, when it got up, would be on our extreme right. McPherson was directed to get his trains out of the way of the troops and to follow Hovey's division as closely as possible. McClernand had 2 roads about 3 miles apart, converging at Edwards Station, over which to march his troops. Hovey's division of his corps had the advance on a 3rd road, the Clinton, still farther north. McClernand was directed to move Blair's and A.J. Smith's divisions by the southernmost of these roads, and Osterhaus and Carr by the middle road. Orders were to move cautiously with skirmishers to the front to feel for the enemy. Smith's division on the most southern road was the first to encounter the enemy's pickets, who were speedily driven in. Osterhaus, on the middle road, hearing the firing, pushed his skirmishers forward, found the enemy's pickets, and forced them back to the main line. About the same time, Hovey encountered the enemy on the northern or direct wagon road from Jackson to Vicksburg. McPherson was hastening up to join Hovey, but was embarrassed by Hovey's trains occupying the roads. I was still back at Clinton. McPherson sent me word of the situation and expressed the wish that I was up. By 7:30 I was on the road and proceeded rapidly to the front, ordering all trains that were in front of troops off the road. When I arrived, Hovey's skirmishing amounted almost to a battle. McClernand was in person on the middle road and had a shorter distance to march to reach the enemy's position than McPherson. I sent him word by a staff officer to push forward and attack. These orders were repeated several times without apparently expediting McClernand's advance. Champion's Hill, where Pemberton had chosen his position to receive us, whether taken by accident or design, was well selected. It is one of the highest points in that section and commanded all the ground in range. On the east side of the ridge, which is quite precipitous, is a ravine running first north, then westerly, terminating at Baker's Creek. It was grown up thickly with large trees and undergrowth, making it difficult to penetrate with troops, even when not defended. The ridge occupied by the enemy terminated abruptly where the ravine turns westerly. The left of the enemy occupied the north end of this ridge. The Bolton and Edwards Station wagon road turns almost due south at this point and ascends the ridge, which it follows for about a mile. Then, turning west, descends by a gentle declivity to Baker's Creek, nearly a mile away. On the west side, the slope of the ridge is gradual and is cultivated from near the summit to the creek. There was, when we were there, a narrow belt of timber near the summit west of the road. From Raymond there is a direct road to Edwards Station, some 3 miles west of Champion's Hill. There is one also to Bolton. From this latter road there is still another, leaving it about 3.5 miles before reaching Bolton, and leads directly to the same station. It was along these 2 roads that 3 divisions of McClernand's corps and Blair of Sherman's, temporarily under McClernand, were moving. Hovey of McClernand's command was with McPherson, farther north on the road from Bolton direct to Edwards Station. The middle road comes into the northern road at the point where the latter turns to the west and descends to Baker's Creek. The southern road is still several miles south and does not intersect the others until it reaches Edwards Station. Pemberton's lines covered all these roads and faced east. Hovey's line, when it first drove in the enemy's pickets, was formed parallel to that of the enemy and confronted his left. By 11 o'clock the skirmishing had grown into a hard contested battle. Hovey alone, before other troops could be got to assist him, had captured a battery of the enemy. But he was not able to hold his position and had to abandon the artillery. McPherson brought up his troops as fast as possible, Logan in front, and posted them on the right of Hovey and across the flank of the enemy. Logan reinforced Hovey with 1 brigade from his division. With his other 2, he moved farther west to make room for Crocker, who was coming up as rapidly as the roads would admit. Hovey was still being heavily pressed and was calling on me for more reinforcements. I ordered Crocker, who was now coming up, to send 1 brigade from his division. McPherson ordered 2 batteries to be stationed where they nearly enfiladed the enemy's line, and they did good execution. From Logan's position now, a direct forward movement carried him over open fields, in the rear of the enemy and in a line parallel with them. He did make exactly this move, attacking, however, the enemy through the belt of woods covering the west slope of the hill for a short distance. Up to this time, I had kept my position near Hovey, where we were the most heavily pressed, but about noon I moved with a part of my staff by our right around until I came up with Logan himself. I found him near the road leading down to Baker's Creek. He was actually in command of the only road over which the enemy could retreat. Hovey, reinforced by 2 brigades from McPherson's command, confronted the enemy's left. Crocker, with 2 brigades, covered their left flank. McClernand 2 hours before had been within 2.5 miles of their centre with 2 divisions, and the 2 divisions, Blair's and A.J. Smith's, were confronting the rebel right. Ransom, with a brigade of MacArthur's division of the 17th Corps, McPherson's, had crossed the river at Grand Gulf a few days before and was coming up on their right flank. Neither Logan nor I knew that we had cut off the retreat of the enemy. Just at this juncture, a messenger came from Hovey asking for more reinforcements. There were none to spare. I then gave an order to move McPherson's command by the left flank around to Hovey. This uncovered the rebel line of retreat, which was soon taken advantage of by the enemy. During all this time, Hovey, reinforced as he was by a brigade from Logan and another from Crocker, and by Crocker gallantly coming up with 2 other brigades on his right, had made several assaults, the last one about the time the road was opened to the rear. The enemy fled precipitately. Between 3 and 4 o'clock I rode forward, or rather back, to where the middle road intersects the north road, and found the skirmishers of Carr's division just coming in. Osterhaus was farther south, and soon after came up with skirmishers advanced in like manner. Hovey's division, and Macpherson's 2 divisions with him, had marched and fought from early dawn, and were not in the best condition to follow the retreating foe. I sent orders to Osterhaus to pursue the enemy, and to Carr, whom I saw personally, I explained the situation and directed him to pursue vigorously as far as the Big Black, and to cross it if he could, Osterhaus to follow him. The pursuit was continued until after dark. The Battle of Champions Hill lasted about 4 hours, hard fighting, preceded by 2 or 3 hours of skirmishing, some of which almost rose to the dignity of battle. Every man of Hovey's division and of Macpherson's 2 divisions was engaged during the battle. No other part of my command was engaged at all, except that as described before. Osterhaus's and A.J. Smith's divisions had encountered the rebel advanced pickets as early as 7:30. Their positions were admirable for advancing upon the enemy's line. McClernand, with 2 divisions, was within a few miles of the battlefield long before noon and in easy hearing. I sent him repeated orders by staff officers fully competent to explain to him the situation. These traversed the wood separating us without escort and directed him to push forward, but he did not come. It is true, in front of McClernand there was a small force of the enemy and posted in a good position behind a ravine obstructing his advance. But if he had moved to the right by the road my staff officers had followed, the enemy must either have fallen back or been cut off. Instead of this, he sent orders to Hovey, who belonged to his corps, to join on to his right flank. Hovey was bearing the brunt of the battle at the time. To obey the order, he would have had to pull out from the front of the enemy and march back as far as McClernand had to advance to get into battle, and substantially over the same ground. Of course, I did not permit Hovey to obey the order of his intermediate superior. We had in this battle about 15,000 men absolutely engaged. This excludes those that did not get up, all of McClernand's command except Hovey. Our loss was 410 killed, 1,244 wounded, and 187 missing. Hovey alone lost 1,200 killed, wounded, and missing, more than 1/3 of his division. Had McClernand come up with reasonable promptness, or had I known the ground as I did afterwards, I cannot see how Pemberton could have escaped with any organised force. As it was, he lost over 3,000 killed and wounded, and about 3,000 captured in battle and in pursuit. Loring's division, which was the right of Pemberton's line, was cut off from the retreating army and never got back into Vicksburg. Pemberton himself fell back that night to the Big Black River. His troops did not stop before midnight, and many of them left before the general retreat commenced, and no doubt a good part of them returned to their homes. Logan alone captured 2,300 prisoners and 11 guns. Hovey captured 300 under fire and about 700 in all, exclusive of 500 sick and wounded whom he paroled, thus making 1,200. Macpherson joined in the advance as soon as his men could fill their cartridge boxes, leaving 1 brigade to guard our wounded. The pursuit was continued as long as it was light enough to see the road. The night of the 16th of May found Macpherson's command bivouacked from 2 to 6 miles west of the battlefield, along the line of the road to Vicksburg. Carr and Osterhaus were at Edwards Station, and Blair was about 3 miles southeast. Hovey remained on the field where his troops had fought so bravely and bled so freely. Much war material abandoned by the enemy was picked up on the battlefield, among it 30 pieces of artillery. I pushed through the advancing column with my staff, and kept in advance until after night. Finding ourselves alone, we stopped and took possession of a vacant house. As no troops came up, we moved back a mile or more until we met the head of the column just going into bivouac on the road. We had no tents, so we occupied the porch of a house which had been taken for a rebel hospital, and which was filled with wounded and dying who had been brought from the battlefield we had just left. While a battle is raging, one can see his enemy mowed down by the 1,000 or the 10,000 with great composure. But after the battle these scenes are distressing, and one is naturally disposed to do as much to alleviate the suffering of an enemy as a friend. We were now assured of our position between Johnston and Pemberton, without a possibility of a junction of their forces. Pemberton might have made a night march to the Big Black, crossed the bridge there, and by moving north on the west side, have eluded us, and finally returned to Johnston. But this would have given us Vicksburg. It would have been his proper move, however, and the one Johnston would have made had he been in Pemberton's place. In fact, it would have been in conformity with Johnston's orders to Pemberton. Sherman left Jackson with the last of his troops about noon on the 16th and reached Bolton, 20 miles west, before halting. His rearguard did not get in until 2 a.m. the 17th, but renewed their march by daylight. He paroled his prisoners at Jackson and was forced to leave his own wounded in care of surgeons and attendants. At Bolton he was informed of our victory. He was directed to commence the march early next day and to diverge from the road he was on to Bridgeport on the Big Black River, some 11 miles above the point where we expected to find the enemy. Blair was ordered to join him there with the pontoon train as early as possible. This movement brought Sherman's corps together, and at a point where I hoped a crossing of the Big Black might be effected, and Sherman's corps used to flank the enemy out of his position in our front, thus opening a crossing for the remainder of the army. I informed him that I would endeavour to hold the enemy in my front while he crossed the river. The advance division, Carr's, McClernand's corps, resumed the pursuit at 3:30 a.m. on the 17th, followed closely by Osterhaus, McPherson bringing up the rear with his corps. As I expected, the enemy was found in position on the Big Black. The point was only 6 miles from that where my advance had rested for the night, and was reached at an early hour. Here the river makes a turn to the west, and has washed close up to the high land. The east side is a low bottom, sometimes overflowed at very high water, but was cleared and in cultivation. A bayou runs irregularly across this low land, the bottom of which, however, is above the surface of the Big Black at ordinary stages. When the river is full, water runs through it, converting the point of land into an island. The bayou was grown up with timber, which the enemy had felled into the ditch. At this time there was a foot or two of water in it. The rebels had constructed a parapet along the inner bank of this bayou by using cotton bales from the plantation close by and throwing dirt over them. The whole was thoroughly commanded from the height west of the river. At the upper end of the bayou there was a strip of uncleared land which afforded a cover for a portion of our men. Carr's division was deployed on our right, Lawler's brigade forming his extreme right and reaching through these woods to the river above. Osterhaus's division was deployed to the left of Carr and covered the enemy's entire front. McPherson was in column on the road, the head close by, ready to come in wherever he could be of assistance. While the troops were standing as here described, an officer from Banks's staff came up and presented me with a letter from General Halleck, dated the 11th of May. It had been sent by the way of New Orleans to Banks to be forwarded to me. It ordered me to return to Grand Gulf and to cooperate from there with Banks against Port Hudson, and then to return with our combined forces to besiege Vicksburg. I told the officer that the order came too late, and that Halleck would not give it now if he knew our position. The bearer of the dispatch insisted that I ought to obey the order, and was giving arguments to support his position when I heard great cheering to the right of our line, and looking in that direction saw Lawler in his shirt-sleeves leading a charge upon the enemy. I immediately mounted my horse and rode in the direction of the charge, and saw no more of the officer who delivered the dispatch. I think not even to this day. The assault was successful, but little resistance was made. The enemy fled from the west bank of the river, burning the bridge behind him and leaving the men and guns on the east side to fall into our hands. Many tried to escape by swimming the river. Some succeeded and some were drowned in the attempt. 18 guns were captured and 1,751 prisoners. Our loss was 39 killed, 237 wounded and 3 missing. The enemy probably lost but few men except those captured and drowned. But for the successful and complete destruction of the bridge, I have but little doubt that we should have followed the enemy so closely as to prevent his occupying his defences around Vicksburg. As the bridge was destroyed and the river was high, new bridges had to be built. It was but little after 9 a.m. when the capture took place. As soon as work could be commenced, orders were given for the construction of 3 bridges. One was taken charge of by Lieutenant Haynes of the Engineer Corps, one by General McPherson himself, and one by General Ransom, a most gallant and intelligent volunteer officer. My recollection is that Haynes built a raft bridge, McPherson a pontoon, using cotton bales in large numbers for pontoons, and that Ransom felled trees on opposite banks of the river, cutting only on one side of the tree, so that they would fall with their tops interlacing in the river, without the trees being entirely severed from their stumps. A bridge was then made with these trees to support the roadway. Lumber was taken from buildings, cotton gins, and wherever found, for this purpose. By 8 o'clock in the morning of the 18th, all 3 bridges were complete and the troops were crossing. Sherman reached Bridgeport about noon of the 17th and found Blair with the pontoon train already there. A few of the enemy were entrenched on the west bank, but they made little resistance and soon surrendered. 2 divisions were crossed that night, and the 3rd the following morning. On the 18th I moved along the Vicksburg road in advance of the troops, and as soon as possible joined Sherman. My first anxiety was to secure a base of supplies on the Yazoo River above Vicksburg. Sherman's line of march led him to the very point on Walnut Hills occupied by the enemy the December before when he was repulsed. Sherman was equally anxious with myself. Our impatience led us to move in advance of the column and well up with the advanced skirmishers. There were some detached works along the crest of the hill. These were still occupied by the enemy, or else the garrison from Haynes's Bluff had not all got past on their way to Vicksburg. At all events, the bullets of the enemy whistled by thick and fast for a short time. In a few minutes, Sherman had the pleasure of looking down from the spot coveted so much by him the December before on the ground where his command had lain so helpless for offensive action. He turned to me, saying that up to this minute he had felt no positive assurance of success. This, however, he said was the end of one of the greatest campaigns in history, and I ought to make a report of it at once. Vicksburg was not yet captured, and there was no telling what might happen before it was taken. But whether captured or not, this was a complete and successful campaign. I do not claim to quote Sherman's language, but the substance only. My reason for mentioning this incident will appear further on. McPherson, after crossing the Big Black, came into the Jackson and Vicksburg road which Sherman was on, but to his rear. He arrived at night near the lines of the enemy and went into camp. McClernand moved by the direct road near the railroad to Mount Albans, and then turned to the left and put his troops on the road from Baldwin's Ferry to Vicksburg. This brought him south of McPherson. I now had my 3 corps up the works built for the defence of Vicksburg, on 3 roads, one to the north, one to the east, and one to the southeast of the city. By the morning of the 19th, the investment was as complete as my limited number of troops would allow. Sherman was on the right and covered the high ground from where it overlooked the Yazoo as far southeast as his troops would extend. McPherson joined on to his left and occupied ground on both sides of the Jackson Road. McClernand took up the ground to his left and extended as far towards Warrenton as he could, keeping a continuous line. On the 19th, there was constant skirmishing with the enemy while we were getting into better position. The enemy had been much demoralized by his defeats at Champion's Hill and the Big Black, and I believed he would not make much effort to hold. Vicksburg. Accordingly, at 2 o'clock, I ordered an assault. It resulted in securing more advanced positions for all our troops, where they were fully covered from the fire of the enemy. The 20th and 21st were spent in strengthening our position and in making roads in the rear of the army, from the Yazoo River or Chickasaw Bayou. Most of the army had now been for 3 weeks with only 5 days' rations issued by the commissary. They had an abundance of food, however, but began to feel the want of bread. I remember that in passing around to the left of the line on the 21st, a soldier, recognizing me, said in rather a low voice, but yet so that I heard him, "Hard tack." In a moment the cry was taken up all along the line, Hard tack, hard tack. I told the men nearest to me that we had been engaged ever since the arrival of the troops in building a road over which to supply them with everything they needed. The cry was instantly changed to cheers. By the night of the 21st, all the troops had full rations issued to them. The bread and coffee were highly appreciated. I now determined on a second assault. Johnston was in my rear, only 50 miles away, with an army not much inferior in numbers to the one I had with me, and I knew he was being reinforced. There was danger of his coming to the assistance of Pemberton, and after all, he might defeat my anticipations of capturing the garrison if, indeed, he did not prevent the capture of the city. The immediate capture of Vicksburg would save sending me the reinforcements which were so much wanted elsewhere, and would set free the army under me to drive Johnston from the state. But the first consideration of all was, the troops believed they could carry the works in their front, and would not have worked so patiently in the trenches if they had not been allowed to try. The attack was ordered to commence on all parts of the line at 10 o'clock a.m. on the 22nd, with a furious cannonade from every battery in position. All the corps commanders set their time by mine so that all might open the engagement at the same minute. The attack was gallant, and portions of each of the three corps succeeded in getting up to the very parapets of the enemy and in planting their battle flags upon them. But at no place were we able to enter. General McClernand reported that he had gained the enemy's entrenchments at several points and wanted reinforcements. I occupied a position from which I believed I could see as well as he what took place in his front, and I did not see the success he reported. But his request for reinforcements being repeated, I could not ignore it, and sent him Quinby's division of the 17th Corps. Sherman and McPherson were both ordered to renew their assaults as a diversion in favour of McClernand. This last attack only served to increase our casualties without giving any benefit whatever. As soon as it was dark, our troops that had reached the enemy's line and been obliged to remain there for security all day were withdrawn, and thus ended the last assault upon Vicksburg. I now determined upon a regular siege, to outcamp the enemy, as it were, and to incur no more losses. The experience of the 22d convinced officers and men that this was best, and they went to work on the defences and approaches with a will. With the navy holding the river, the investment of Vicksburg was complete. As long as we could hold our position, the enemy was limited in supplies of food, men, and munitions of war to what they had on hand. These could not last always. The crossing of troops at Bruinsburg commenced April 30th. On the 18th of May, the army was in rear of Vicksburg. On the 19th, just 20 days after the crossing, the city was completely invested and an assault had been made. 5 distinct battles, besides continuous skirmishing, had been fought and won by the Union forces. The capital of the state had fallen, and its arsenals, military manufactories, and everything useful for military purposes had been destroyed. An average of about 180 miles had been marched by the troops engaged, but 5 days' rations had been issued and no forage. Over 6,000 prisoners had been captured, and as many more of the enemy had been killed or wounded. 27 heavy cannon and 61 field pieces had fallen into our hands, and 400 miles of the river, from Vicksburg to Port Hudson, had become ours. The Union force that had crossed the Mississippi River up to this time was less than 43,000 men. One division of these, Blair's, only arrived in time to take part in the Battle of Champion's Hill, but was not engaged there, and one brigade, Ransom's of McPherson's corps, reached the field after the battle. The enemy had at Vicksburg, Grand Gulf, Jackson, and on the roads between these places over 60,000 men. They were in their own country, where no rear guards were necessary. The country is admirable for defence, but difficult for the conduct of an offensive campaign. All their troops had to be met. We were fortunate, to say the least, in meeting them in detail. At Port Gibson, 7 or 8,000, at Raymond, 5,000, at Jackson, from 8 to 11,000, at Champion's Hill, 25,000, at the Big Black, 4,000. A part of those met at Jackson were all that was left of those encountered at Raymond. They were beaten in detail by a force smaller than their own, upon their own ground. Of the wounded, many were but slightly so, and continued on duty. Not half of them were disabled for any length of time. After the unsuccessful assault of the 22nd, the work of the regular siege began. Sherman occupied the right starting from the river above Vicksburg, McPherson the centre, MacArthur's division now with him, and McClernand the left, holding the road south to Warrenton. Lohman's division arrived at this time and was placed on the extreme left of the line. In the interval between the assaults of the 19th and 22nd, roads had been completed from the Yazoo River and Chickasaw Bayou, around the rear of the army, to enable us to bring up supplies of food and ammunition. Ground had been selected and cleared on which the troops were to be encamped, and tents and cooking utensils were brought up. The troops had been without these from the time of crossing the Mississippi up to this time. All was now ready for the pick and spade. Prentice and Hurlbut were ordered to send forward every man that could be spared. Cavalry especially was wanted to watch the fords along the Big Black and to observe Johnston. I knew that Johnston was receiving reinforcements from Bragg, who was confronting Rosecrans in Tennessee. Vicksburg was so important to the enemy that I believed he would make the most strenuous efforts to raise the siege, even at the risk of losing ground elsewhere. My line was more than 15 miles long, extending from Haynes's Bluff to Vicksburg, thence to Warrenton. The line of the enemy was about 7. In addition to this, having an enemy at Canton and Jackson, in our rear, who was being constantly reinforced, we required a second line of defence facing the other way. I had not troops enough under my command to man these. General Halleck appreciated the situation and, without being asked, forwarded reinforcements with all possible dispatch. The ground about Vicksburg is admirable for defence. On the north it is about 200 feet above the Mississippi River at the highest point and very much cut up by the washing rains. The ravines were grown up with cane and underbrush, while the sides and tops were covered with a dense forest. Farther south, the ground flattens out somewhat and was in cultivation. But here, too, it was cut up by ravines and small streams. The enemy's line of defence followed the crest of a ridge from the river north of the city eastward, then southerly around to the Jackson Road, full 3 miles back of the city, thence in a southwesterly direction to the river. Deep ravines of the description given lay in front of these defences. As there is a succession of gullies, cut out by rains along the side of the ridge, the line was necessarily very irregular. To follow each of these spurs with entrenchments, so as to command the slopes on either side, would have lengthened their line very much. Generally, therefore, or in many places, their line would run from near the head of one gully nearly straight to the head of another, and an outer work triangular in shape, generally open in the rear, was thrown up on the point. With a few men in this outer work, they commanded the approaches to the main line completely. The work to be done, to make our position as strong against the enemy as his was against us, was very great. The problem was also complicated by our wanting our line as near that of the enemy as possible. We had but 4 engineer officers with us. Captain Prime of the Engineer Corps was the chief, and the work at the beginning was mainly directed by him. His health soon gave out when he was succeeded by Captain Comstock, also of the Engineer Corps. To provide assistance on such a long line, I directed that all officers who had graduated at West Point, where they had necessarily to study military engineering, should in addition to their other duties assist in the work. The chief quartermaster and the chief commissary were graduates. The chief commissary, now the Commissary General of the Army, begged off, however, saying that there was nothing in engineering that he was good for unless he would do for a sap roller. As soldiers require rations while working in the ditches as well as when marching and fighting, and as we would be sure to lose him if he was used as a sap roller, I let him off. The general is a large man, weighs 220 pounds, and is not tall. We had no siege guns except 6 32-pounders, and there were none at the west to draw from. Admiral Porter, however, supplied us with a battery of navy guns of large calibre, and with these and the field artillery used in the campaign, the siege began. The first thing to do was to get the artillery in batteries where they would occupy commanding positions, then establish the camps under cover from the fire of the enemy but as near up as possible, and then construct rifle pits and covered ways to connect the entire command by the shortest route. The enemy did not harass us much while we were constructing our batteries. Probably their artillery ammunition was short, and their infantry was kept down by our sharpshooters, who were always on the alert and ready to fire at a head whenever it showed itself above the rebel works. In no place were our lines more than 600 yards from the enemy. It was necessary, therefore, to cover our men by something more than the ordinary parapet. To give additional protection, sandbags, bulletproof, were placed along the tops of the parapets far enough apart to make loopholes for musketry. On top of these, logs were put. By these means, the men were enabled to walk about erect when off duty, without fear of annoyance from sharpshooters. The enemy used in their defence explosive musket balls, no doubt thinking that bursting over our men in the trenches they would do some execution, but I do not remember a single case where a man was injured by a piece of one of these shells. When they were hit and the ball exploded, the wound was terrible. In these cases, a solid ball would have hit as well. Their use is barbarous because they produce increased suffering without any corresponding advantage to those using them. The enemy could not resort to our method to protect their men because we had an inexhaustible supply of ammunition to draw upon and used it freely. Splinters from the timber would have made havoc among the men behind. There were no mortars with the besiegers, except what the navy had in front of the city, but wooden ones were made by taking logs of the toughest wood that could be found, boring them out for 6 or 12-pound shells and binding them with strong iron bands. These answered as cohorns, and shells were successfully thrown from them into the trenches of the enemy. The labour of building the batteries and entrenching was largely done by the pioneers, assisted by Negroes who came within our lines and who were paid for their work. But details from the troops had often to be made. The work was pushed forward as rapidly as possible, and when an advanced position was secured and covered from the fire of the enemy, the batteries were advanced. By the 30th of June, there were 220 guns in position, mostly light field pieces, besides a battery of heavy guns belonging to, manned and commanded by the Navy. We were now as strong for defence against the garrison of Vicksburg as they were against us, but I knew that Johnston was in our rear and was receiving constant reinforcements from the east. He had at this time a larger force than I had had at any time prior to the Battle of Champion's Hill. As soon as the news of the arrival of the Union Army behind Vicksburg reached the north, floods of visitors began to pour in. Some came to gratify curiosity, some to see sons or brothers who had passed through the terrible ordeal. Members of the Christian and sanitary associations came to minister to the wants of the sick and the wounded. Often those coming to see a son or brother would bring a dozen or two of poultry,